Welcome. You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts, Sylvia and Sylvia Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us. I'm delighted to be joined by Jorge Marti. He's the Secretariat of HENSAF Venezuela. Thank you for joining us, Jorge.
It's a pleasure, as always.
Now, the world has been on pins and needles witnessing the attack on Ukraine. And for many, it has been, an easy street to demonize, right, Russia for its actions. And I feel that what brings us to this point is important. And since 1989, the U.S. has been the empire, and it has broken several agreements that has now put Russia on alert. How do you read the situation, and where should we focus in this conflict?
Well, I'm the secretary of the HENSAF Venezuela campaign. What am I doing talking about Ukraine and Russia? But in fact, a few years ago, I also participated in the setting up of the Solidarity with Anti-Fascist Resistance in Ukraine campaign. So I did quite a lot of research about the region, and I talked to a lot of comrades in Ukraine, in Russia, and so on. And I tried to inform myself about the real situation. And I think that this is the first thing that we need to say. Here in the West, I'm in London, you're in Canada. We are subjected to a barrage of propaganda on the part of our own imperialists. And on the basis of this, you cannot understand what is happening in Ukraine or in Russia. And the first task that you have is to cut through the fog of lies and propaganda and try to understand the real reasons for this conflict. I would also like to say straight from the beginning that I am against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think that Russia's motives are not democratic, they're not clear. They are imperialist motives. But the reasons I am against Russia's invasion have nothing to do with the hypocritical reasons that the West is opposing this intervention. The Western powers have no moral standing to criticize anyone about anything. Now they go on about territorial integrity being violated, national sovereignty, and so on. But they are the ones who've been doing exactly the same thing for so long, for hundreds of years, but even in the last 20 years. NATO bombed Serbia for 78 days, killing dozens, hundreds of innocent civilians in 1999. Today I was hearing Jens Stoltenberg, I think his name is, the General Secretary of NATO. He was saying, Russia's using cluster bombs, this is illegal, it's a war crime. But NATO used cluster bombs in the bombing of Serbia in 1999. And nothing was said at that time. Apparently, at that time, it wasn't a war crime. Or, for instance, the other day I heard Condoleezza Rice, who was the Secretary of State in 2003 when the United States invaded Iraq, and she was being interviewed on Fox News, and they said to her, so this is a scandal because when a country invades another sovereign country, that's a war crime. And Condoleezza Rice kept a straight face and said, yes, she nodded along. Condoleezza Rice was responsible for the invasion of Iraq, a sovereign country. Wasn't that a war crime at the time? So, and even today, you don't have to go back in time. Even today, there's a criminal war going on of Saudi Arabia against Yemen. And this war is being conducted in the most atrocious manner. The first thing they did was to bomb the harbors so they wouldn't have any food coming in. They've been bombing markets, schools, weddings, hospitals. And Saudi Arabia, nothing said about that. There are no journalists in Yemen giving you the day-to-day rundown of what is happening. Because why? Because Saudi Arabia is our friend, is a close ally of U.S. and Western imperialism, so therefore we don't say anything about this. So I think our first task is precisely to denounce the hypocrisy of Western imperialism. Then about this question that you asked, because I think that this is important to put it in context. Yes, Russia has now invaded Ukraine, but this conflict didn't start on the 24th of February. This conflict started many years ago, after the fall of Stalinism, after the fall of the Soviet Union in 89, 91. The Western imperialism started to push towards the east, and they started advancing, and more countries were joining NATO. And as you say, there was a written, verbal and written guarantees that were given by the West. James Baker, who at the time was the negotiator for the United States, told Gorbachev, and then they put it in writing. There's a document, actually. There's a transcript of that conversation, which is up in some official website in the United States. You can read it. And it says, in exchange for the reunification of Germany, we promise that NATO will not advance an inch towards the east. And what's happened since? Well, I think it's about 17 countries have joined NATO. A whole number of countries in Eastern Europe have joined NATO. And this is rightly so seen as a threat by Russia. By Russia, by whom in Russia? By Russian capitalists, by the Russian government, which is a capitalist government and has its own interests, which are in conflict with the interests of the United States. Yeah. Russia would like to have its own sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, across its border, in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, perhaps also a little bit in the Middle East, in Syria, where they have a naval base. And of course, they can't accept this constant encirclement by NATO. And one thing leads to another. And on both sides, these are imperialist interests. When Putin says he's intervening in the Ukraine in order to defend the interests of the Russian-speaking people in the Donbass, that's just an excuse. In the same way, by the way, that NATO said they were bombing Serbia in order to defend the interest of the Kosovar Albanians. This has nothing to do. Imperialists always look for a so-called humanitarian reason for the intervention. And then when the imperialists talk about sovereignty of Ukraine, what kind of sovereignty are you talking about when in Ukraine you have a government whose economic policies are dictated by the IMF, and its government is subject to the whims of the U.S. embassy. This is no independent sovereign government, but a puppet of U.S. imperialism in the region. So there's a lot of hypocrisy, and our first task as people who live in the West, in Canada, in Britain, or in the United States, is to denounce our own ruling class and the imperialist designs. Everyone now says about civilian victims of this conflict in Ukraine, and there are all imperialist wars. There's no surgical strikes, as they say, as the U.S. said in relation to Afghanistan and Iraq. Any war kills innocent civilians. They're the ones who pay the price for big powers fighting over markets and resources. But no one says anything about the fact that in Ukraine there has been a civil war going on for 8 years, in which the government in Kiev responded to an uprising and protest in the east of the country by waging a unilateral war against their own people. And I think it's about 14,000 people have been killed in the Donbass in these last eight years. There was no outcry about that, or the fact that this war is being conducted partially by neo-Nazi battalions, which are incorporated in the Ukrainian National Guard. And they are funded and armed, given weapons and training, not only by the Ukrainian government, but also by the governments of the UK, the government of Canada, and the government of the United States. And these are the people who are at the front line of this war. Now we see about the siege of Mariupol in our TV screens. Well, Mariupol is the place where the Azov battalion is based, a neo-Nazi formation of thousands of armed men who are part of the Ministry of Interior in Ukraine. And so that explains why there's so much resistance. And in the process, of course, many innocent people and civilian infrastructure is bombed and destroyed. It's terrible. Lenin once said, by the way, war is terrible. Yes, war is terribly profitable. we have seen in the last few days the stocks and the shares of weapons companies in the UK and in Europe, in the United States, going up through the roof. They're gonna make a lot of money out of the suffering of ordinary civilians and working people, and so on. And then the response of the West is what? Impose sanctions on Russia. Who's going to pay for these sanctions? We know what sanctions mean. Yeah. Sanctions mean that ordinary working people in Russia will pay for these sanctions.
When we think about empire, in many ways, the empire of the day is the U.S. And when we think about NATO expanding into the East, people think, oh, they're bringing democracy. That's how the media plays it here. But NATO is a military arm of empire, and it's at the service of the U.S. So can you talk a little bit about the significance of both the NATO incursion, right? And then the economic arm of violence, which is the IMF, that rules and dictates how people should, allocate their economic wealth, at the service of empire.
And NATO claims, no, we're not a threat to anyone. We are a defensive alliance. And yes, as you say, we're bringing democracy. They're not bringing democracy. They're bringing capitalism and subjection to U.S. imperialism. That's what they're bringing. I mean, it's hard to describe Turkey as a democratic country, as a country that is destroying its own Kurdish people in the east and its own working class across the whole country. It's hard to describe, Hungary as a fully democratic country. And, in the meantime, they say, in Russia, number of media, newspapers and radio stations have been closed down. And yes, they have. And that's a reactionary consequence of war. But over here, they just banned Russia Today and Sputnik from broadcasting in the whole of the European Union. And so now they say, these are arms of the Russian state that they only give you propaganda. Yeah, so now we don't have access to that propaganda. We're only subject to our own propaganda. That's completely scandalous. And yes, as you say, it's not just NATO, it's the IMF. And I will add, and the European Union, they dictate the economic policies. And in fact, if the European Union is interested in Ukraine at all, is as a reserve of cheap labor, cheap skilled labor. Millions of people from Ukraine have had to emigrate because of the collapse of the economy, and the collapse of the economy has come because of the restoration of capitalism. And the way this has been carried out, there's been a massive looting of state property by a number of oligarchs. Avakov, Akhmenov, Kolomoisky, Poroshenko himself, all of these people benefited, they became millionaires. How? By looting state property. And then by turf wars, by killing each other and so on. And now this government of Zelensky was about to carry out a further program of massive privatization of state-owned enterprises, of which there are still some which are a remnant of the old industrial power of Soviet Ukraine. This is also violence. Millions of people forced to emigrate, thousands killed in the civil war. Parties being driven underground. The Communist Party has been illegalized in Ukraine a few years ago, and all the left organizations have been forced underground or into exile. This is also violence, and this is the way U.S. imperialism advances. And you are completely correct. In my opinion, Russia acts as an imperialist power, but Russia's imperialism is not comparable at all to that of the United States. The United States imperialism is much stronger and therefore much more aggressive and reactionary by many degrees of magnitude. It has a much more powerful economy, a much more powerful army, military bases everywhere, and a much higher percentage of military spending, and is ruthless in the pursuit of the interests of U.S. multinationals. And we have seen this. Yeah. Not only in Europe, in Eastern Europe, but everywhere, in the Middle East, in Latin America, in Africa, everywhere.
In many ways, it's a very dangerous game, despite the fact that the U.S. is still a more powerful empire. Russia does have, thousands of nuclear weapons at its disposal, and it is playing with fire, bringing NATO into war with Russia. Can we talk a little bit about the consequences? Because, when the U.S. bombed Libya in a so-called preemptive war, no one blinked an eye, right? When Israel bombs, Palestinians, there's no news reporting, right? And the world just accepts some words as sanctioned and other words are denounced, right? And for those of us who have been through war, no war is is justified, right? Like the loss of human life should always be denounced. And also, I think the time of empires, it's about time we the workers see beyond that, right? And unite across borders, because really our so-called elected officials are not going to do it for us.
We should also understand, for instance, the other day they had this resolution at the United Nations General Assembly against Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it was passed with, 178 votes in favor and 30 or 40 abstentions, I can't remember. But then the United Nations plays no real role. It's just a talking shop. But the United Nations has passed almost unanimous resolutions, for instance, against the blockade of Cuba for 20 years. Last time it was, I think, 194 votes against the blockade, 2 in favor, Israel and the United States, and 2 abstentions, Brazil and Ukraine. Before that, they passed another resolution against the oppression of the Palestinians, and that's also passed unanimously with the votes against of Israel and the United States. And it serves absolutely for nothing. So when they talk about international law, what they really mean is the law of the one who has the mightiest military, the mightiest army, the mightiest military power. But yes, we are against imperialist wars, but in order to achieve peace, you need to understand where these wars come from. These wars, they don't come because Putin is mad, as they say, or because Biden is crazy. It's not that. It's economic power, economic interests, the interest of the multinationals, that they need sources of raw materials, sources of energy, markets for the products, markets for export of capital. This is what imperialism is in the last 100 years. And so in order to put an end to imperialism, which is the cause of wars of aggression, you need to put an end to the system that's behind it, the capitalist system. And this you can only do by the workers coming to power and removing this unelected, unaccountable minority of millionaires who run countries and the world in the interest of their own private profit. This is the only way forward. Yeah. You can feel sorry for the human loss. Anyone who's human will have empathy for the victims of war. But if you're really serious about putting an end to war, then you need to take the road of revolutionary change.
One of the things that I'm very aware of is that we are told constantly, the capitalist system is just, in a cycle, right? It will recover. And, the collapse of the capitalist system in 2008, we're still dealing with an economic collapse that we haven't recovered from. And what someone who works in investment told me, this war is excellent for oil. The oil prices are going up. And as you say, right, we need to realize that the source, the root of all these issues is not, the politics of one country or another, but rather the system that drives it, right? And the system that is being, that fuels very few people, very few powerful people, and the rest of us just fight amongst each other for the crumbs. So as we see other parts of the world, constantly in resistance of capitalism. We see it in Cuba, after 60 years of blockades and sanctions, the people of Cuba are still standing, they're still thriving in ways that are unimaginable because they have, they've been blocked, and yet they have one of the most advanced medical systems in the midst of pandemic. They have done amazing compared to some industrialists in Western countries, even Canada or the UK, or the US for that matter. So clearly we are resilient people. We are, able to fight back, to create systems despite the aggression we're faced. Venezuela is another example. With all the sanctions, they're still being able to fight back all the incursions and the invasions the states has thrown at them. What does this chapter mean for them? Like this war with Russia clearly will block some support that they may have received from Russia. How do you feel this might impact some of the social movements in Latin America?
Yes, I think we should look at this from at least two different points of view. One is what you were saying at the beginning about the economic crisis, and in my opinion, this war and the sanctions of the West against Russia will worsen the economic situation in general. Higher oil prices and higher gas prices will hit the economies of ordinary people who have to heat their homes, and they have to switch on the lights. And at a time when energy prices were already going up very, very quickly, this will add to inflationary pressures that already existed in the world economy, and it will disrupt world trade to a certain extent, and this can trigger another economic recession when we, as you say, we haven't still fully recovered from the one in 2008, never mind the one during the pandemic. So this is the future of capitalism, future of at best, sluggish economic growth and constant relapses into recession. And working people are going to be asked to pay for this. This is the worst part of this. During the pandemic, the government spent a lot of money bailing out the companies, bailing out the big business. But now when the recession comes, we will have to pay. They will not make any sacrifices. This is how the system works. Then there's the other side of what's the impact of this for countries in Latin America. And first of all, there's the immediate practical consequences. Higher prices of oil are good for Venezuela. But the problem is that Venezuela is under sanctions from the U.S., so it's difficult to sell this oil. It still has some customers, China, Iran, and other countries, but obviously it makes the whole situation much more difficult. But yes, in a certain sense, partially, let's say, Venezuela will benefit from higher oil prices at the time when it's starting to recover its production slightly. Then in the case of Cuba, I will say that Cuba was relying to a certain extent on Russian tourism coming into the island, and this is now been cut off. Russian planes, they've been blocked from the airspace of many other countries. It's been stopped, the flux of tourists to Cuba. On a more general point of view, yes, these two countries, Venezuela and Cuba, surrounded and blockaded by U.S. imperialism, had made some deals with other countries, Russia and China amongst them. And if Russia's economy is severely hit by this recession, then by these sanctions and military aggression, economic aggression, then they will be in less of a position to help Venezuela and Cuba. At the end of the day, what I will say is that in the medium and long term, the only solution is the revolution must spread to other countries. You can't really have revolution just in one country and having to depend on allies which are not trustworthy allies, because in reality Russia is a capitalist country. Russia doesn't share the same project of the Bolivarian Revolution or the Cuban Revolution, where in Cuba capitalism has been abolished. However, Russia might be interested for geostrategic reasons in helping these two countries. That's a different matter. But the only reliable allies that the Venezuelan working people and the Cuban Revolution can have is the workers of other countries that are also going through certain experiences. They are learning, they are developing the tools of struggle, and in my opinion, they should emulate the Cuban Revolution by taking an anti-capitalist road. In the medium term, this is the only solution. In the short term, we'll have to struggle with what we have, what's available to us. But the general strategy should be one of revolution, workers and peasants and the poor rising up and taking power and removing the capitalists from power in one country after another. This is the only way to end with a system that causes war, suffering, hunger, and so on for hundreds of millions of people all the time.
What excites you? What are some of the exciting revolutionary processes you see that are not being covered in the media right now because they're trying to focus us on this idea of impending doom between Russia and NATO? And in the process, we lose sight of our own responsibility, our own power to create revolutionary movements within our countries, within our communities.
Yes, I will say that one interesting thing that's happened as we come to the end of the pandemic, hopefully, is that there has been a certain recovery of the workers' movement in a number of advanced capitalist countries. In what sense? This is not yet a massive wave of strikes or anything like this, but there has been an uptick of industrial activity because as inflation goes up, the workers are forced to fight back and try to recover their purchasing power. So we've seen big strikes, for instance, in Spain, of the metal workers in Cádiz. They went on an all-out strike sometime at the end of last year. And here in Britain, we've seen a spate of strikes of, for instance, of cleaners and security guards in hospitals and universities, that they want their contracts taken back in-house instead of being outsourced. And some of them have won. Yesterday, one group of workers, about 300 outsourced cleaners at the Barts Hospital, they won the contract being taken back in-house. Or refuse collectors, they managed to get big pay increases as a result of the lack of skilled lorry drivers, and in order to recover the purchasing power of the wages. There's been lots of movements like this, some big, some small, but that I will say indicate the beginning of the recovery of the workers' movement. Right now, there is a massive national dispute of university lecturers in Britain and also in the United States. So last November, there was an uptick of industrial activity, big groups of workers declaring strikes or voting for strike. Some of them going on strike against the wish of their trade union leaders, which is also very interesting. So that's one thing. The other thing I will say is that the pandemic has also brought a general questioning of the capitalist system as a system that is unable to deal with a health emergency this way, because it always puts profits before people's lives. And now I will say, with this situation of war, this contradiction becomes even more apparent. You know, there is they tell us there's no money for education, for healthcare, for pensions, but they very quickly find money for war, for sending weapons to Ukraine, for rearming NATO, and all of this. It's always the same when it's in the interest of the ruling class. They find money. They find money where? By squeezing the workers even more. And this, I will say, will add to this general mood of questioning of the capitalist system. To this, we have to add, obviously, the climate emergency, which is also not being dealt with, also because of capitalist interests. So I will say we live in very interesting times.
Thank you for listening to Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an independently produced syndicated radio program made available for free to campus and community radios, and also to the world at latinwavesmedia.com. Please visit the website to hear previous shows, hear about upcoming events, and consider becoming a member for as little as $1 per month.